Patricia had exactly $5 in the entire world. She spent it on the one man everyone else was terrified to even look at. What she asked him to do changed both of them forever. The sun was bleeding orange across the glass storefronts of Bay Street when Raymond K. Howard stepped out of the blacked-out Escalade. No bodyguards today. Just him, the custom Tom Ford suit, and the kind of silence that makes civilians cross the street without knowing why. Tattoos crawled up his neck like black flames. The city had learned long ago that looking too long at Raymond was a good way to disappear. He stopped on the sidewalk to light a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the scar that ran through his left eyebrow. This was his ritual, 10 minutes of quiet before the night's violence began. Normal people hurried past, eyes down. The air itself seemed to part for him. That's when he saw her. A tiny girl, 7, maybe 8, standing 20 feet away, frozen between a pretzel cart and a mailbox. Messy brown ponytail, gray cardigan 2 sizes too big, faint purple-yellow bruise peeking beneath the sleeve. She clutched a yellowed envelope like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She started walking toward him. Not running. Not crying. Just walking. Each scuff of her worn sneakers sounded impossibly loud against the city noise. Raymond exhaled smoke, watching her close the distance most made men wouldn't dare. He assumed lost kid, runaway, someone would claim her any second. No one did. She stopped exactly 3 feet away, close enough to see the dried tear tracks, far enough to bolt if she had to. Her voice came out small but steady, cracking only on the last word. "Are you Mr. Raymond Howard?" He didn't answer. He never confirmed his name to strangers. But he didn't walk away either. The girl lifted both hands, offering the envelope like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I need help," she whispered. "And I can pay." A humorless breath left his throat, half laugh, half disbelief. He'd been offered briefcases of cash, islands, blood oaths. Never $5 from a child who looked like she hadn't eaten in 2 days. "What kind of help costs $5? He asked, voice low, curious despite himself. She pushed the envelope closer. Her fingers shook now, but her eyes never left his. Inside was a single worn $5 bill and a note in purple crayon, letters carefully pressed. "My mom is gone. The police won't look. You're the only one who can find her. Please." The words punched straight through 20 years of armor. Memories flooded in without permission. Another little girl, same eyes, same trembling courage, same plea he'd been too late to answer. His sister. Raymond stared at the bill, then at the bruise on the girl's wrist, then at the unbearable trust in her face. He took the envelope. "Name," he said. "Patricia," she answered. "Patricia Caldwell." He folded the $5 once, slipped it into his breast pocket, right over his heart, and crouched so they were eye level. "Patricia Caldwell," he said, voice rougher than he meant it to be, "you just hired the most dangerous man in this city." A pause. The smallest, faintest smile ghosted across her lips. "Now tell me everything you saw." "Now tell me everything you saw." Raymond stayed crouched on the sidewalk, the golden light dying behind him, until he realized a grown man kneeling in front of a 7-year-old girl on a busy street was going to draw attention neither of them could afford. He straightened, slipped one large hand gently around her tiny wrist, careful, like she was made of blown glass, and steered her toward the Escalade idling at the curb. "Get in," he said, voice low. Patricia didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the leather seat like she'd been riding in bulletproof SUVs her whole life, knees together, envelope pressed to her chest. The driver, Vincent, 20 years on payroll, never asked questions, met Raymond's eyes in the mirror and got nothing back but a single nod. Safe house, not the penthouse. Not yet. They rode in silence for 3 blocks before Raymond spoke again. Start from the night it happened. Every detail. Even the ones that feel small. Patricia's voice was soft, but it didn't waver anymore. "Mommy works nights at the hospital cafeteria. Tuesday she got off at 11, same as always. I wait for her on the fire escape, so I can see her coming up MLK Boulevard. She waves at me every single time." A tiny, proud smile flickered across her face, then vanished. That night, she never waved. A big white van pulled up real fast. No lights on the top, just plain white with blue letters on the side. A man got out. He was tall. Baseball hat. He grabbed her arm and pushed her inside. She tried to scream, but he put his hand over her mouth. Raymond's knuckles went white on the armrest. What did the letters say? Patricia closed her eyes, remembering. Atlantic. Atlantic something. I couldn't read the rest because it was dark. Atlantic Coastal Logistics. Raymond knew the company. Owned shell after shell, paid its taxes on time, and moved a lot of containers after midnight that never got opened by customs. He filed the name away like a bullet in the chamber. Anything else about the man? Walk. Voice? Anything? She shook her head. He smelled like cigarettes and that blue soap the janitors use at school. Vincent turned onto a quiet industrial street in the warehouse district and stopped in front of a windowless brick building that looked abandoned to anyone who didn't know better. Raymond got out first, scanned the block out of habit, then opened Patricia's door himself. Inside, the place was sterile and warm, concrete floors painted battleship gray, steel desks, no decorations except a corkboard covered in photos of men who no longer breathed. A single lamp glowed in the corner. His real office. Not the one with the skyline view and the Monet knockoff. He lifted Patricia onto a cracked leather chair that swallowed her whole, then dragged a second chair opposite and sat. Again, he said, softer this time. From the top. Slower. She told it 3 times. Each telling added one new detail. The van had a dent in the back door shaped like a smile. The man had a scar on the back of his right hand. Her mother dropped her hospital ID badge when she was dragged away, and Patricia had run downstairs barefoot to get it before the van sped off. Raymond recorded nothing. He didn't need to. Every syllable branded itself behind his eyes. When she finished the 3rd telling, her voice cracked at last. She pressed the envelope to her mouth like it could hold the tears back. Raymond reached out, hesitated, then rested 2 fingers lightly on the crown of her head. You did good, kid. Real good. He stood, pulled a burner phone from the drawer, and stepped into the hallway. Vincent was already waiting. Fine, Marco. Tell him I want eyes on the girl 24/7. No contact, no approach, just ghosts. She so much as crosses the street alone. I want to know before her second foot hits the asphalt. Vincent nodded once and disappeared. Raymond dialed a second number. Tommy 2 times. I need everything you've got on Atlantic Coastal Logistics. Drivers, night shift logs, warehouse leases, who signs the checks. Quiet. You breathe my name, and I'll pull your tongue out through your ass. He hung up before Tommy could answer. Back inside the office, Patricia's head had begun to nod. The adrenaline that had carried her across the city was finally burning out. Raymond watched her fight sleep the way wounded soldiers fight shock, pure willpower running on fumes. He took the softest thing in the room, an old army blanket from a footlocker, and draped it over her shoulders. She curled instantly into it, knees to chest, envelope still clutched like a teddy bear. Raymond dimmed the lamp until only a thin blade of light cut across the floor. Then he sat at the desk opposite her and began to work. By midnight, he had 4 legal pads filled with names, routes, license plates, and question marks. By 2 a.m., he'd spoken to 6 different street informants who all said some version of the same thing. People in Patricia's building had seen the van, but nobody was talking to cops. One old woman had even found the mother's hospital badge in the gutter and thrown it away because bad luck to keep things from the vanished. At 3:17 a.m., Tommy sent a single photo to the burner. Grainy CCTV still of a white panel van with the Atlantic Coastal logo, caught on a traffic cam 3 blocks from Patricia's apartment at 11:09 p.m. Tuesday night. Dent in the back door shaped like a smile. Raymond stared at the image until the pixels burned. Organized. Professional. Silent. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random predator. This was extraction. He looked across the room. Patricia had slipped sideways in the chair, blanket half on the floor, mouth slightly open. A thin line of drool darkened the leather armrest. She looked impossibly small. Something ancient and jagged moved behind Raymond's ribs. He recognized the feeling. He'd buried it with his sister 23 years ago under 6 feet of pine and regret. He stood slowly, walked over, and crouched again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He lifted Patricia, blanket and all, and carried her to the small cot in the back room he sometimes used when a war lasted until dawn. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, trusting even in sleep. He laid her down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and left the door cracked so the light from his desk could reach her. Back at his workstation, he opened a drawer and took out a silver picture frame he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a Polaroid of a dark-haired girl about Patricia's age, gap-toothed smile, holding a stuffed giraffe. His sister, Elena. Taken 3 weeks before she disappeared. He set the frame beside the legal pads, facing him. Then, he picked up the phone again. Change of plans, he told Vincent. Marco shadows her, but if anyone gets within 50 yards who doesn't belong, they don't walk away to try again. Clear? Vincent's reply was immediate. Crystal. Raymond hung up and stared at the 2 sleeping girls, one in the photograph, one behind the door, until the sky outside turned the color of weak coffee. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the folded $5 bill Patricia had given him, and laid it flat on the desk between the photo and the legal pads. $5. That was the price of the war he was about to start. He didn't feel tired anymore. He felt awake in a way he hadn't since he was 17 and digging an empty grave with his bare hands. Raymond leaned back in the chair, rolled the sleeves of his $1,500 shirt, and got to work mapping every route the van could have taken, every warehouse it could have gone to, every man who might have been behind the wheel. Somewhere around the 20th page of notes, he realized he hadn't once thought about the cost, money, bodies, favors, years off his life. None of it mattered. A 7-year-old girl had paid him everything she had. He would tear the city apart brick by brick until her mother was back in her arms, or until there was no city left to tear. Outside, the first delivery trucks of the morning began rumbling toward the docks, unaware that a storm with no name had already started moving in their direction. In the back room, Patricia stirred, murmured "Mommy" once in her sleep, and clutched the empty envelope tighter. Raymond heard it. He didn't look up from the maps, but his jaw flexed hard enough to crack a lesser man's molars. The $5 case was open, and Raymond K. Howard never closed a case until someone paid in full. The city never really slept, but by 3 in the morning it pretended to. Raymond stood alone on the observation deck of his penthouse, 47 floors above the river, watching red and white lights crawl along the bridges like slow blood cells. Behind him, spread across a matte black dining table that had never seen a meal, were photographs, shipping manifests, customs declarations, and a single child's crayon drawing of a blue boat with yellow windows. He had not slept in 51 hours. Below, the port looked innocent from this height. Neat rows of colored containers stacked like Lego bricks, cranes frozen mid-reach, security lights glowing soft and harmless. Raymond knew better. He had spent the last 2 nights proving it. It started with a night shift dock foreman who suddenly decided to take a permanent vacation in the ICU. Raymond had only asked 3 questions. The man answered the first 2 through tears and the third through a mouthful of broken teeth. After that, the names spilled faster than the blood. Atlantic Coastal Logistics was a ghost on paper. Perfect taxes, perfect safety record, perfect political donations. But every Tuesday and Friday, between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., 2 specific containers left Pier 39 without ever passing through the gamma ray scanner. The same containers arrived from Cartagena, Veracruz, or Port-au-Prince with seals that had never been officially broken. The same containers were trucked to a bonded warehouse in the old Navy Yard that didn't appear on any public map. Raymond had walked the fence line himself at 2:17 a.m. the night before. Motion sensors, dogs, cameras on independent power, armed guards who carried suppressed rifles, and the relaxed posture of ex-special forces. Not the kind of security you hire to protect televisions and sneakers. He had taken photographs with a lens the length of a bazooka, then gone home and pulled the property records. The warehouse was owned by a Delaware LLC that was owned by a Cayman Trust that was owned by a charitable foundation whose chairman lunched every Thursday with the junior senator from the state. The circle was closing, and it was bigger than one missing cafeteria worker. His phone vibrated once. Vincent. Black sedan, no plates, 2 occupants. Parked across from St. Ignatius Elementary since 6:40. Left at 7:55 when first bell rang. Same car circled the block behind the girl's apartment building yesterday. Raymond's reply was a single word: eliminate. He meant the threat, not the men.
Yet.
He turned from the window. The penthouse was silent except for the low hum of the air system and the soft scratch of crayon on paper. Patricia sat cross-legged on the ebony floor in an oversized Yankees t-shirt that hung to her knees, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth as she colored. She had been with him 4 days now. 4 days since he'd carried her sleeping body from the warehouse office and decided, without discussion, without plan, that she was not going back to an empty apartment where men in black sedans already knew the address. His men had almost swallowed their tongues when he walked through the private elevator with a child in his arms. "Boss, we can put her with."
No.
That was the entire conversation. Now the same apartment that had never known a child's footprint was slowly being claimed. Crayons on the marble island. A half-eaten box of Lucky Charms on a shelf that used to hold limited edition Japanese whiskey. A pink stuffed rabbit propped against a $40,000 throw pillow like it belonged there. Raymond watched her shade the sky purple because she had informed him solemnly, nighttime is scarier when it's pretty. He felt the crack inside him widen another millimeter. She had not asked once when she could go home. She seemed to understand, in the way only children and animals do, that home was no longer safe. He crossed the room and crouched beside her. "What's this one?" he asked, tapping the paper. "That's the big building where the bad boat hides," she said without looking up. "It has a fence with the curly wire on top, and a man with a really big gun who stands by the door and never smiles." Raymond's blood turned to ice water. She had never been to the Navy Yard warehouse. He was certain of it. He kept his voice level. "How do you know about the man with a gun, Patricia?" She shrugged, switching to a green crayon for the grass. "I saw him in my dream. He was smoking and looking at pictures of me on his phone." For the first time in 20 years, Raymond felt fear that had nothing to do with dying. He stood slowly. "Stay right here. Don't open the door for anyone but me." She nodded, already lost in the purple sky. He walked to the hallway, dialed Vincent again, and spoke so quietly the words barely disturbed the air. "Bring the car to the sub-basement. Full team. Warlord. We're moving the girl tonight. And Vincent, if that black sedan shows up again, I want the occupants breathing, but only technically." 23 minutes later the penthouse was empty except for the faint smell of marshmallows and the crayon drawing left on the table like evidence. They took the service elevator that opened directly into the underground garage. Vincent and Marco, both in plain clothes, both carrying enough firepower to start a small revolution, flanked Raymond as he carried Patricia, now wrapped in his suit jacket because she had fallen asleep again the moment the elevator moved. She weighed nothing and everything. The convoy was 3 vehicles. They left the garage doing 90, took a ramp directly onto the expressway, and merged into the flow of anonymous traffic. Only when they were 20 miles north of the city did Raymond allow himself one exhale.
Patricia stirred against his chest.
"Are we running away?" she mumbled into a shirt. "No," he said. "We're changing the rules." She considered that, then nodded once and slipped her small hand into his much larger one. Her fingers were sticky with marshmallow dust. He didn't pull away. Back in the city, the black sedan returned to St. Ignatius at 3:10 p.m. It circled the block twice, slower each time, before parking in the same spot as the day before. The men inside never saw the 3 vans that boxed them in from opposite directions. They never felt the needles that put them to sleep before the doors even opened. When they woke up, they were zip-tied in a room that smelled of rust and the river. Raymond stood over them holding Patricia's latest drawing, the one with the purple sky and the man with the big gun. He didn't raise his voice. He rarely had to. "Start talking," he said, and I'll let you keep the parts you were born with. By dawn, he had names, routes, schedules, and a set of access codes that made his teeth ache with how easy the next step was going to be. He also had confirmation. They had been watching Patricia's school for 3 days waiting for her to reappear. They had orders to bring her in quietly, no marks. Raymond stared at the two men until one of them started crying. Then he made a phone call that ended with the sound of a single gunshot and the river accepting another secret. When he returned to the safe house north of the city, Patricia was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal with a serving spoon because all the normal ones were too small. She looked up and smiled like he was any regular man coming home from work. "Hi, Mr. Raymond. I saved you the last marshmallow." He sat down across from her, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. She noticed, of course. Kids always do. She pushed the bowl toward him. "It's okay to be scared," she said matter-of-factly. "Mommy says even brave people get scared. They just don't let it drive the car." Raymond stared at the rainbow marshmallow floating in milk and felt the crack inside him split wide open. He took the spoon she offered, ate the marshmallow, and did not trust himself to speak for a very long time. Outside, the sun rose over fields he hadn't seen in years, gilding the frost on the grass. Inside, a Mafia boss who had killed men with his bare hands learned that some things were more terrifying than death. One of them was a 7-year-old girl trusting him completely. The other was the realization that he would burn the entire world down before he let anyone take that trust away. The hidden network had no idea what was coming for it, but it would learn. It would learn the way every empire eventually learns when it makes the mistake of threatening something Raymond K. Howard had decided was his to protect. The war had moved underground now, and underground was where Raymond had always done his best work. The safe house north of the city was a converted farmhouse with creaking floors and a fireplace that actually worked. Raymond had bought it under a dead man's name 15 years ago and never once spent the night. Now it smelled faintly of cinnamon oatmeal and the strawberry shampoo he'd sent Marco to buy at 2 a.m. because little girls like smells that aren't gun oil. The kitchen table had become headquarters. Satellite photos, burner laptops, and coffee rings fought for space, with a plastic placemat decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. Raymond sat hunched over a shipping ledger, tracing container numbers with a red Sharpie, eyes bloodshot but ferocious. Patricia was supposed to be napping. Instead, she was perched on 2 phone books in his leather desk chair, feet swinging, tongue between teeth, turning a sheet of printer paper into an ocean of violent crayon. Raymond didn't notice at first. He was too busy memorizing the arrival schedule of a Panamanian-flagged freighter named Orchid Dawn that had never carried orchids or seen dawn in the legal sense. "Daddy Longlegs," Patricia announced suddenly. He glanced up, confused. "What?" "That's what Mommy called it. The big boat with the yellow windows that goes past our window sometimes when the river is high. It has legs like a spider because it's so tall." Raymond's pen stopped moving. He turned slowly. She was holding up her drawing, a child's version of the port at night. Black skies streaked with purple, gray water, and in the middle, an enormous dark blue yacht with a white superstructure and a perfect row of golden yellow lighted windows along the second deck. His pulse thudded once, hard, against his eardrums. "Patricia, when did you see this boat?" She shrugged, switching to a brown crayon for the deck. "The night Mommy didn't come home. It was parked by the big fence where the trucks go. The man with the scar hand walked Mommy past it. I saw the lights from the fire escape. They looked like monster eyes." Raymond crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the chair. "Show me again." She pointed proudly.
"See?
"Yellow windows. And it has a name on the side, but I can't read grown-up writing yet. It starts with a big S and has a bird." He knew the boat before she finished the sentence. Serena's Grace. 180 feet of floating diplomatic immunity registered to Senator William H. Carver, chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee, frequent cable news saint, and silent partner in half the shell companies Raymond had spent a week bleeding people to expose. The yacht spent most of its life docked at a private slip inside the old Navy Yard, the same restricted warehouse Patricia had already drawn in her sleep. The room narrowed to a tunnel. Sound receded. The red Sharpie slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor. High-level corruption wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a neon sign written in a 7-year-old's crayon. Patricia's mother hadn't been kidnapped. She had been erased because she'd accidentally seen something on a smoke break behind the hospital, something that happened under the yellow windows of a boat that should never have been anywhere near MLK Boulevard at midnight. Raymond's hands started shaking, not from fatigue this time. He stared at the drawing until the yellow windows blurred. 23 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. He was 17 again, standing in the rain outside a trailer park in Newark, clutching a Polaroid of his sister Elena waving from a swing set. She had vanished on a Tuesday. Same kind of white van. Same kind of silence from people who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. The detectives had said runaway. The streets had said worse. He had torn the city apart for 2 years looking for her. Found pieces, a shoe, a hair ribbon, a grainy CCTV still of her being carried onto a blue boat with yellow lights docked in Red Hook. By the time he traced the ownership, the trail had been cauterized by lawyers and senators and men in suits who golfed with judges. He had killed the men he could reach. The ones he couldn't, the ones with flags on their lapels and security details, had watched him rise anyway, because fear was the only tax they couldn't avoid. He had buried the rest of the story with Elena. Told himself some monsters were too big. Until right now. Until a little girl with oatmeal on her chin drew the exact same boat in purple crayon and handed him the final piece he'd been hunting his entire adult life. Raymond's voice came out rough, like gravel poured over glass. Patricia. She looked up, startled by the tone. He took the drawing gently, as if it might disintegrate, and placed it in the center of the table among the satellite photos and the carnage of his investigation. Then he did something he had never done in front of another human being. He cried. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just 2 silent tracks down the cheeks of a man whose face was a road map of violence. Patricia slid off the chair and patted over. She didn't ask questions. She simply wrapped both skinny arms around his neck and pressed her face to his shoulder the way children do when they sense a storm and decide to be the calm. After a minute or 10, he got control again. He lifted her, so they were eye level. Listen to me, he said, voice raw but steady. That boat? I know it. I've known it for a very long time. And the men on it took someone from me the same way they took your mom. Her eyes went wide, but she didn't speak. I couldn't save her, he whispered. The confession tasted like rust. I was too young, too small. Not anymore. He set her down, turned back to the table, and swept every paper to the floor in one violent motion. Then he laid Patricia's drawing in the exact center, flattened it with both palms like it was the new blueprint for the rest of his life. I need you to stay with Marco tonight. You'll be safe. I promise. She started to protest, but he knelt again and touched one finger to her lips. No arguments this time. What comes next isn't for little girls. But when it's over, your mommy is going to walk through that door holding your hand. You hear me? She searched his face, then nodded slowly. He pulled her into a hug that was too tight, and not tight enough. Over her shoulder, he stared at the crayon boat and the yellow windows that had haunted 2 generations. The monsters thought they were untouchable. They had never met the man Elena's disappearance had created. Raymond released Patricia, stood, and rolled his neck once. The sound was like ice cracking on a lake. He took out his phone. Vincent, he said when the line clicked open. Call everyone who still owes me their life. Tell them the debt's due tonight. We're going after the Serena's Grace. And Vincent. A pause. We're not asking permission. He hung up, looked one last time at the drawing, and folded it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, right next to the worn $5 bill that had started everything. Then he walked to the gun safe, spun the dial, and began loading magazines with the calm precision of a man who had finally found the last page of a story he thought would never end. Outside, the sky was turning the color of dried blood. Inside, a promise older than Patricia was alive again. Not again. Never again. The war had a target now, and the target had a name written in purple crayon. The farmhouse lasted exactly 9 more hours. At 4:12 a.m., the motion sensors on the eastern tree line went dark. Vincent's voice came over the comm, flat and urgent. Drones.
2.
Military-grade thermal. They just painted the house. Raymond was already moving. He scooped Patricia from the couch where she'd fallen asleep watching an old cartoon on a tablet. Pink Rabbit clutched to her chest, mouth open, one sock missing. She came awake with a gasp, eyes wild.
Sure.
It's me. We're leaving. He carried her down the back stairs to the barn, Marco ahead clearing corners, Vincent behind carrying the go-bags. They slid into the false floor of a horse trailer that smelled of hay and diesel. 40 seconds later, the first hellfire took the farmhouse off the map in a blossom of orange and black. The explosion lit the night like a second sun. Patricia buried her face in Raymond's neck and didn't make a sound. They drove south in silence, 3 vehicles leapfrogging through back roads. No lights, no GPS. By dawn they were in the city again, but not the city anyone knew. They descended a freight ramp behind an abandoned fish processing plant on the South Riverfront and disappeared into a tunnel that hadn't appeared on any map since the Cold War. Raymond's final sanctuary, a decommissioned civil defense bunker 30 feet under the sludge and concrete, built to survive nuclear winter and forgotten by every administration since Reagan. Steel door, retinal scan, lead-lined walls. The air tasted of rust and old secrets. He carried Patricia inside and set her on a cot that still had the original army blanket folded at the foot. She looked around, cinder block walls, humming fluorescent tubes, shelves of MREs, and whispered, "It's like a submarine for sad people." He almost smiled. Almost. Vincent and Marco took up stations at the 2 entrances. The rest of the crew dispersed to safe houses with new orders. No one surfaces until Raymond says. For the first time in weeks, the 2 of them were alone. Patricia sat on the cot, knees to chest, Rabbit in her lap. She hadn't cried once during the escape, but now the tears came sudden and violent, shaking her whole body. Raymond stood frozen in the middle of the room, hands opening and closing uselessly. He had faced cartel sicarios, Russian vor, federal strike teams. None of it had prepared him for a sobbing 7-year-old. He crossed the room in 3 stiff steps, sat on the edge of the cot, and did the only thing he could think of. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her into his chest. She was burning hot and trembling like a trapped bird. "I want Mommy," she choked into his shirt. "I know. They blew up the house with the dinosaurs." "I know." She cried until there was nothing left, then hiccuped against him for a long time. When the storm passed, she was asleep again, limp and heavy with exhaustion. He laid her down, pulled the army blanket to her shoulders, and sat on the floor beside the cot with his back to the wall and a Glock in his lap. He did not sleep. At 9 o'clock, the secure laptop chimed. Encrypted files from the team that had survived the night. Photographs. Ledger scans. Audio intercepts. Senator Carver on a satellite phone. Voice comm. Clean it. All of it. The woman saw the manifest. The kid's a loose end. Pay whatever it takes. A CEO of a private prison conglomerate wiring $12 million to an offshore account labeled Enterprises, Blackwater Expansion. A Port Authority official signing off on humanitarian aid, containers that weighed 200 pounds more leaving than they did arriving. And the crown jewel, live satellite feed, taken 6 hours ago, of Blackwater Dock, Pier 94. A grainy thermal image of a shipping container with a single heat signature inside, curled into the fetal position.
Alive.
Raymond stared at the screen until the image burned into his retinas. He closed the laptop, rested his forehead against the cool metal edge, and whispered the first prayer he'd spoken since childhood. Then he stood up and went to work. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled violence. A break-in team hit one of his secondary safe houses in Jersey for men, night vision, suppressed rifles. They found nothing but claymores wired to the light switches. 3 died instantly. The 4th was zip-tied and delivered to the bunker, missing only non-essential fingers. A sniper took a perch on the roof of the building opposite the penthouse, which they still believed Raymond occupied. Marco's counter-sniper put a .338 round through the scope and into the man's brain from 800 yards away. The bodies stayed on the roof for 12 hours as a message. They were closing the circle, and they were desperate. Raymond used their desperation like a scalpel. On the third night, he took Vincent and two others, men who had lost sisters too, and paid a visit to a townhouse in Georgetown. The senator's chief of staff, Gregory L. Walsh, opened the door in silk pajamas and terror. Raymond didn't speak. He simply stepped inside, closed the door with his foot, and put a gun to Walsh's forehead. 10 minutes later, Walsh was on his knees in his own kitchen, piss staining the marble, telling everything. Yes, the woman was alive. Yes, Blackwater Dock, container 88 to 417, scheduled for offshore transfer tomorrow night when the storm hits. Yes, the senator would be watching from the Serena's Grace anchored half a mile out. No, there was no extraction plan. The container was going to disappear at sea. Raymond pressed the muzzle harder. One more question, he said quietly. How many others? Walsh sobbed out a number that turned Raymond's vision red. He left Walsh breathing barely and walked out into the rain. Back in the bunker, Patricia was awake when he returned. She had found an ancient box of crayons someone had left decades ago and was drawing on the back of a decontamination poster. She didn't look up when he entered, but her shoulders were rigid. I heard you, she said in a small voice. On the phone. You said Mommy's in a box by the water. Raymond's heart stopped. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her. She was trembling again, lower lip caught between her teeth. You're going to save her, right? The question hung in the air like a blade. He took both of her hands in his. They disappeared completely inside his palms. I gave you my word, Patricia. Tomorrow night, I'm bringing her back to you. Or I'm not coming back at all. Her eyes searched his face, ancient and terrified and brave all at once. She nodded once, then crawled into his lap and held on like he was the only solid thing left in the world. He held her back just as tightly. Above them, 30 feet of concrete and river muck, the city went about its business. Below, in a bunker built for the end of the world, a Mafia boss and a 7-year-old girl waited for a storm. The net had tightened to a noose. Tomorrow night it would either choke the monsters or strangle the last piece of humanity Raymond had left. Either way, someone was going to learn what happened when you put the two people Raymond K. Howard loved most in the entire world inside the same cage. He kissed the top of Patricia's head, tasted salt and strawberry shampoo, and whispered into her hair the promise he had failed to keep once before. This time I'm big enough. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor like distant artillery. The storm was almost here, and Blackwater Dock was waiting. The storm arrived early. By late afternoon, the sky over the harbor had turned the color of a fresh bruise. Wind whipped whitecaps across the river, tore flags from their poles, and hurled rain sideways against every window in the city. Sirens wailed somewhere distant, then gave up. Even the gulls had vanished. Raymond stood on the loading dock of an abandoned cold storage warehouse 2 miles south of Blackwater, watching the water boil. His coat snapped around his legs like a battle flag. Behind him, 8 men waited in absolute silence.
8.
That was all he had called.
Not an army.
Not a crew. 8 names he had written on a single sheet of paper with his own hand, then burned the paper so no one else would ever know who walked into the fire tonight. Vincent. Marco. Tommy 2 times. Rico from the old neighborhood, who still owed Raymond for burying his mother proper. Dimitri, the ex-Spetsnaz who never spoke unless someone was bleeding. 3 others who had lost sisters, daughters, or both to men who wore suits and smiles on television. They stood in a loose half-circle, rain streaming off black tactical gear, rifles slung, eyes flat and ready. No speeches. No bravado. They already knew what this was. Raymond turned to them. Water ran down his face like tears he would never allow. Container 88 to 417, he said, voice barely louder than the storm, yet every man heard it clear. Woman inside. Name's Maria Caldwell. She breathes free tonight, or none of us do. Clear? 8 heads nodded once. He looked at Vincent last. If I go down, you burn the yacht. You burn the dock. You burn every name on the list. No trials. No prison. Salt the earth. Vincent's reply was a smile that had no warmth. Already packed the thermite, boss. Raymond gave one final nod, then climbed into the lead SUV. Doors slammed. Engines growled to life. The convoy rolled out into the teeth of the storm like black sharks cutting through gray water. 43 minutes away, 30 feet underground, Patricia sat on the cot with her knees pulled to her chest. The pink rabbit was crushed against her heart. Around her neck hung the small silver locket Raymond had pressed into her hand an hour ago. Inside the locket was no picture, just a single line engraved in tiny letters. You were never alone. She whispered it over and over like a prayer, rocking slightly, eyes fixed on the steel door. The bunker lights flickered every time thunder shook the earth overhead. She didn't cry. She was saving every tear for when her mother walked through that door. Back on the surface, Raymond's convoy killed their lights 2 blocks from Blackwater Dock and ghosted forward on momentum and memory. They abandoned the vehicles in the lee of a container stack and moved on foot. The storm was their ally now. Rain hammered security cameras into uselessness. Wind screamed loud enough to cover the snip of bolt cutters. Lightning flashes turned night into stuttering daylight, then plunged it back into absolute black. Raymond led point. He moved like a man who had rehearsed this moment in nightmares for 23 years. They breached the outer fence at 23:07. 2 guards never saw the knives that opened their throats. Dimitri dragged the bodies into the shadows and took their radios. Inside the wire, the dock was a maze of steel boxes and sodium lights swaying like hanged men. Waves exploded against the pilings, sending spray 20 feet into the air. The air stank of diesel, rotting fish, and ozone. Raymond raised a fist. The team melted into pre-assigned positions. He crouched behind a forklift and studied the layout through a monocular. Container 88 to 417 sat alone on the far pier, doors facing the water, chain and customs seals still intact for now. 50 yards beyond it, the Serena's Grace rocked at anchor, yellow windows glowing defiantly through the storm like predator eyes. And on the yacht's flybridge, silhouetted whenever lightning strobed, stood a tall man in a long coat holding binoculars. Raymond knew that silhouette, had seen it in grainy photographs and decades of hate. Victor Langston Hale, former federal prosecutor turned security consultant. The man who signed the shipping manifests with one hand and shook senators' hands with the other. The man whose private ledger, recovered from Walsh's safe 2 nights ago, contained Elena Howard's intake number dated the same week she vanished. The past and the present collided inside Raymond's chest with the force of a detonating mine. Emotion and violence collided inside him. He felt his heartbeat in his teeth. Vincent slid in beside him, rain pouring off his helmet. Guards rotating every 4 minutes. Dogs are inside because of the weather. We have a 6-minute window when the yacht's searchlight sweeps the other direction. After that, it's a straight run to the container. Raymond didn't answer immediately. He was staring at Hale on the flybridge, at the man who had ordered his sister drugged, crated, and shipped like livestock. Vincent waited. He knew the look. Raymond finally spoke, voice calm, almost conversational. Change of plans. Container first. Mother alive. Then we take the yacht. Hale doesn't leave that boat breathing. Vincent's eyes flicked to his boss, saw the thing living behind them, and simply nodded. They moved. 60 seconds of blinding rain and howling wind. Marco laid down suppressed fire on the 2 guards near the container, center mass, no sound but the wet slap of bodies hitting concrete. Rico slapped a thermal charge on the lock. The seal glowed orange, then fell away. Raymond reached the doors first. He wrenched them open against the wind. Inside, chained to a steel ring bolt, soaked in her own filth, barely conscious, was Maria Caldwell. She raised her head at the rush of storm air. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but her eyes, Patricia's eyes, found him through the darkness. "Patricia," she rasped. "She's safe," Raymond said. "I'm taking you home." He knelt, used bolt cutters on the ankle chain, and caught her as she collapsed forward. She weighed less than her daughter. Tommy tossed him a mylar blanket. Raymond wrapped it around her trembling body and lifted her into his arms like she was made of ash. Container secure. 2319. They exfiltrated the way they came, ghosts again, leaving no footprints in the pounding rain. But Raymond paused at the edge of the pier and looked back at the yacht. Hale was still on the flybridge, coat whipping around him, shouting into a radio. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating both men at the same moment. 50 yards of black water apart. 23 years of blood and grief apart. Hale raised one hand in a mocking salute. Raymond answered with a single gesture, 2 fingers pointed like a gun, then dropped to his throat in the universal promise of a cut. The storm swallowed both men in darkness again. Vincent's voice in his ear. Clock's ticking, boss. We've got maybe 4 minutes before they lock the dock down. Raymond turned away from the yacht. Maria Caldwell cradled against his chest and started walking. The raid on the container had been the warm-up. The real war started now. Behind them, thunder rolled like artillery finding range. Ahead, the city lights flickered and died as the storm took the grid. Raymond stepped off the pier into the teeth of the hurricane, 8 loyal shadows at his back, a dying woman in his arms, and a promise burning in his mouth like communion wine. The monsters thought the rain would hide them. They were wrong. The rain was just the opening salvo. Raymond disappeared into it, coat flapping, eyes fixed on the glowing yellow windows of the Serena's Grace. He was coming, and hell was riding his coattails. The storm did not rage. It screamed. Rain came in sheets thick enough to drown a man standing still. Lightning strobed white-hot, turning the world into a silent film of violence, freeze, flash, while thunder followed so close it felt like artillery in the ribs. Blackwater Dock had become an island of war in the middle of the deluge. Raymond's team hit the perimeter at 23:47 exactly. No subtlety now. Suppressors were off. The storm would swallow the noise anyway. Vincent and Dimitri laid down a curtain of fire on the guard shack, full auto bursts that shredded corrugated metal and the men inside it. Rico lobbed 2 thermite grenades onto the main gate. The magnesium flare lit the rain blood red for 3 full seconds before the gates folded inward like paper. They flowed through the breach in a black wedge, 8 shadows moving as one organism. Guards spilled out of the warehouse offices. 12, maybe 15, automatic weapons spitting fire into the dark. Raymond's men answered with disciplined cruelty. Short, controlled bursts. Advance.
Flank.
Execute. Raymond moved at the tip of the spear, a force of nature in human skin. He shot a man-center mass at 20 yards while running full speed, never breaking stride. Another guard rose from behind a forklift with an AK. Raymond put 2 rounds through the bridge of his nose before the muzzle even cleared the tire. Lightning flashed. For one frozen instant the dock was lit like a stage. Bodies falling, muzzle flashes, rain frozen midair like silver needles. He reached the lone container, 88 to 417 alone. The customs seal was already cut. The doors hung open 6 inches, swaying in the wind. He wrenched them wide. Maria Caldwell was there, chained by the ankle to a ring bolt, curled on her side in a puddle of rainwater and terror. Her hospital scrubs hung off her like wet paper. One eye was swollen shut. Her lips were split and bleeding. But she was breathing. She lifted her head at the rush of storm air. Patricia? The name came out a cracked whisper. Raymond dropped to one knee, rain hammering his back, and snapped the chain with the bolt cutters he'd carried for this exact moment. She's safe, he said. I've got you. He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted. She weighed nothing. Less than nothing. Maria's good eye found his face through the downpour. Recognition flickered. You're the man from the street. Yeah, he said, voice rough. Your daughter hired me. He turned to leave the container. That was when the spotlight hit them. A blinding white beam from the Serena's Grace anchored 50 yards offshore, sweeping the dock like a prison tower. The yacht's PA crackled to life, amplified over the storm. Howard. Victor Langston Hale's voice, cultured, amused, the same voice that had ordered Elena drugged and shipped 23 years ago. You're too late, you know. The merchandise is already loaded for transfer. Walk away. Live. Raymond looked toward the yacht. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating Hale on the flybridge. Tall, silver-haired, long coat whipping, one hand raised in mock benediction. Raymond's answer was to raise his Glock and empty the entire magazine toward the spotlight. Glass exploded. The beam died. He carried Maria out of the container into the teeth of the fight. His men had formed a moving perimeter, pushing the remaining guards back toward the warehouse offices. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls. The dock reeked of cordite and blood and salt. Vincent appeared at his side, soaked to the bone, rifle smoking. Yachts raising anchor. They're running. Raymond handed Maria to Tommy, gentle, reverent, then turned toward the water. The Serena's Grace was already moving, engines thundering, yellow windows sliding past like a predator turning to flee. Raymond ran. He sprinted the length of the pier, boots pounding wet concrete, rain slashing his face. At the edge he never slowed, just leapt. For one impossible second, he was airborne over Blackwater. Then he hit the yacht's aft deck hard, rolled, came up with the Glock already raised. 2 crew members rushed him with shotguns. He shot the first in the throat, the second in the knee, then finished him as he screamed. He moved forward like death itself. Up the exterior stairs, 2 at a time, bullets sparking off railings around him. He reached the flybridge. Hale stood at the helm, one hand on the throttle, the other holding a stainless .357. He smiled the same smile Raymond remembered from old surveillance photos. Still fighting ghosts, Raymond? Raymond kept walking forward. Rain streamed off the barrel of his gun. Tonight the ghosts fight back. Hale raised the revolver. Raymond shot him twice, center mass, before Hale could squeeze the trigger. The .357 spun away across the deck. Hale looked down at the blooms of red spreading across his white shirt, genuine surprise on his face. He sank to his knees. Raymond stepped close, pressed the muzzle to Hale's forehead. "This is for Elena," he said. Hale's mouth opened, maybe to beg, maybe to curse. Raymond pulled the trigger. The body toppled backward, slid across the teak deck, and hung half over the rail, rain washing the blood into pink rivers that ran into the sea. The yacht's engines roared, still trying to flee on autopilot. Raymond grabbed the wheel, killed the throttle, let momentum carry the boat in a slow, dying circle. Below, his men were already bringing Maria aboard via the swim platform. He looked back toward the dock, now burning in places, emergency lights strobing red through the rain. It was finished. Vengeance and justice, braided together so tightly he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He descended to the main deck. Maria lay on a cushioned bench, blanket around her shoulders, Vincent supporting her head. She was conscious enough now to reach for him with trembling fingers. Raymond knelt. She caught his hand, gripped it with whatever strength she had left. "Pleased," she whispered, voice barely audible over the dying storm. "Protect her, my little girl." Raymond leaned close so she could see his eyes. "I already am," he said. The words were a vow carved into the air between them. Maria's swollen lips curved in the faintest smile. Then her eyes fluttered shut. Not death, just surrender to exhaustion and relief. Raymond stood. He looked at Vincent, at the men who had followed him into hell without hesitation. "Take us home," he said. The Serena's Grace limped back toward the burning dock, riding low in the water, yellow windows finally dark. Raymond stood at the rail with Maria Caldwell cradled against his chest, rain washing the blood from his hands, thunder rolling away into the distance like a retreating army. The storm was breaking. Behind them, Blackwater dock burned like a funeral pyre. Ahead, somewhere under 30 feet of concrete and river water, a 7-year-old girl waited with a pink rabbit and a silver locket. Raymond looked down at the woman in his arms, alive because her daughter had been brave enough to spend $5 on a monster. He tightened his hold. The war wasn't over. But the first battle belonged to the little girl who had hired him. And Raymond K. Howard carried her mother through the storm toward the moment when a family would be made whole again. The penthouse was quiet for the first time in weeks. No radios crackling. No burner phones vibrating across marble. Only the low hum of the city 47 floors below and the soft patter of leftover rain against the glass. Raymond had carried Maria Caldwell up in the private elevator himself, her head against his shoulder, too weak to walk but strong enough to keep whispering her daughter's name like a heartbeat. He pushed open the double doors to the master suite he had never let anyone enter, not lovers, not lieutenants, not even the cleaners, and laid Maria on sheets that cost more than most cars. Patricia was already there. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed for hours, washed and dressed in new pajamas Marco had bought, soft blue ones with tiny moons, silver locket glinting at her throat, pink rabbit crushed in her arms. The second she saw her mother, everything else in the world disappeared. Mommy. The word came out broken and perfect at the same time. She flew across the room and landed on the bed like a small comet. Maria's arms came up on pure instinct, wrapping around her daughter, pulling her close as if she could fuse them back together. They cried the way only people who thought they had lost each other forever can cry, loud, messy, grateful, unstoppable. Raymond stood in the doorway, soaked and blood-spattered and suddenly unsure where to put his hands. Vincent appeared behind him, silent question in his eyes. Raymond shook his head once. Leave us. The door closed without a sound. Inside the bedroom, mother and daughter held each other until there were no tears left, only the shaky breathing of miracles. Eventually Maria's swollen eye found Raymond across the room. She tried to speak, couldn't, tried again. Thank you, she rasped. Whatever you are, thank you. He nodded once, throat too tight for words. Patricia slipped off the bed and padded over to him on bare feet. She reached up and took his hand, his huge, scarred, blood-crusted hand, and tugged him toward the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. He let her. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the mattress, while Patricia crawled into the space between her mother and this terrifying man who had become their entire universe. Maria's fingers found his sleeve, squeezed once. He covered her hand with his own, careful, like she might break. They stayed like that for a long time. Later, after the doctor Vincent smuggled and had cleaned wounds and started for fluids, after Maria had drunk 2 glasses of water and fallen into the first real sleep she'd had in weeks, Patricia led Raymond by the hand out to the living room. The city sparkled beyond the windows, wet and clean and indifferent. She made him sit on the floor, him, Raymond K, Howard, on imported Italian rug, while she fetched her crayon box and a fresh sheet of thick white paper. She worked in silence for 20 minutes, tongue between teeth, legs folded under her. When she finished, she crawled into his lap without asking, something no one on earth had ever done, and held the drawing up so he could see. 3 stick figures under a yellow sun. One small with brown pigtails and a pink rabbit. One taller with long dark hair and a smile. One very tall in a black coat, holding both their hands. Underneath, in purple crayon and careful capital letters, Patricia, Mommy,
Ray.
She had drawn hearts around all 3 names. Raymond stared at it until the lines blurred. Patricia's voice was soft, almost shy. Why did you help me, Mr. Raymond? I only had $5. He set the drawing down like it was made of glass and lifted her, so she straddled his knee, facing him. For the first time in decades, he let someone see everything. When I was 17, he began, voice low, I had a little sister, Elena. She was 7, same as you. Same eyes. Same fearlessness. She liked to draw, too. He reached into his inside pocket and took out the worn Polaroid he had carried for 23 years, Elena on a swing, gap-toothed, laughing. Patricia studied it solemnly. Some very bad men took her, he continued. Same kind of men who took your mom. I looked for her every day. I got bigger. Meaner. I built all of this. He gestured vaguely at the penthouse, the city, the empire of fear. So I could find the people who hurt her. But I was too late. She was gone. His voice cracked on the last word. He didn't try to hide it. Patricia reached up and touched the tear that had escaped down his cheek, wonder in her eyes. "I couldn't save Elena," he whispered. "But then you walked up to me on the street with $5 and every ounce of courage in your body, and you looked at me like I could still be the man who saves little girls. You reminded me of her. And I thought, maybe this time I wouldn't be too late." He took a shaky breath. "So, I didn't do it for the $5, Patricia. I did it for the 7-year-old kid I used to be who couldn't save his sister. And I did it for you. Because no child should ever have to be that brave alone." Silence stretched between them, huge and gentle. Then Patricia wrapped her arms around his neck and held on like she would never let go. Raymond's arms came around her slowly, carefully, and then crushed her to his chest like she was the only real thing he had ever held. They stayed like that until her breathing evened out and she grew heavy with sleep. He carried her back to the bedroom and laid her beside her mother. Maria stirred, opened her good eye, saw them, and reached out. Raymond took her hand again. Tomorrow, before dawn, a plane would leave a private airstrip with 2 new passports, 2 new names, and enough money to disappear forever. Tonight was all they had left. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket, the one he had bought the day Patricia first fell asleep clutching the envelope, the one he had never planned to give away until this moment. He opened Maria's hand and placed it in her palm. "For her," he said quietly. "Inside it says, you were never alone. So that on the days she misses me, she'll remember she never really lost me." Maria's fingers closed around it. Tears slipped from both eyes this time.
She tried to speak. Couldn't.
Instead, she pulled him down and pressed her forehead to his, mother to unlikely savior, in the only thank you that mattered. Raymond stayed until both of them were asleep, hands intertwined across the pillow, breathing in sync. Then he walked out to the living room, picked up Patricia's drawing, and folded it small enough to fit inside the empty space where Elena's Polaroid had lived for 23 years. He tucked both pictures over his heart. At 4:47 a.m., he kissed Patricia's forehead one last time, breathed in the scent of strawberry shampoo and little girl and second chances, and walked out of the bedroom without looking back. Vincent was waiting by the elevator. "Car's ready," he said softly. Raymond nodded. As the door slid shut, he caught one final glimpse of the 2 sleeping figures in his bed, small and smaller, safe and whole. The elevator descended. 47 floors to the ground. 47 floors to goodbye. When the doors opened in the garage, the city was still dark. Raymond stepped out into the cold pre-dawn air and didn't look up at the penthouse windows. He didn't need to. He carried them with him now, the weight of a mother's hand, the trust of a child, the sound of crayon on paper spelling his name like it belonged next to love. The storm had passed. The monsters were dead. And somewhere far away, when the sun rose on a different life, a little girl would wake up wearing a silver locket and know, without any doubt, that once upon a time a monster had chosen to become her guardian angel instead. Raymond got into the back of the black Escalade. "Drive," he said. The car pulled away from the curb and melted into the waking city. Behind him, the penthouse lights stayed on all night, soft, golden, unnecessary now. Raymond K. Howard never went back. But he never really left either. Some $5 debts can never be repaid. They can only be carried. And he carried theirs for the rest of his life. The plane left at 5:14 a.m. from a private strip carved out of an old cornfield 40 miles west of the city. No tower. No flight plan. Just a single runway lit by chemical flares that hissed in the damp grass. Raymond stood on the ridge above the field, half a mile away, night vision scope pressed to his eye. He had not slept. He did not plan to. The Gulfstream's engine spooled up with a low growl that carried across the frost. Stairs folded down. 2 figures appeared in the doorway, small and smaller, wrapped in identical navy coats against the November chill. Maria walked first, slow but steady now, one hand on the rail, the other cradling Patricia's shoulders. Patricia carried the pink rabbit by one ear, and the silver locket glinted every time the cabin lights caught it. Vincent waited at the bottom of the stairs, no longer armed, no longer needed. He helped Maria aboard, then lifted Patricia the last step so her feet wouldn't touch the wet metal. Before the door closed, Patricia turned and looked out across the dark field. Straight toward the ridge. Straight toward him. She couldn't possibly see him. Too far. Too dark. Scope's green glow hidden against his cheek, but she raised one small hand anyway and pressed it flat against the glass. Raymond's breath fogged the lens. She smiled, just the faintest curve, the kind only people who've been to hell and come back smiling can manage, and mouthed 2 words he felt more than read. "Thank you." Then the door sealed. The flares winked out one by one. The jet taxied, turned, and accelerated into the black, navigation lights shrinking to red and green embers before disappearing entirely. Raymond stayed on the ridge until long after the sound was gone. He stayed until the sun bled pale gold across the horizon and the frost began to melt off the corn stubble. Only then did he lower the scope. He reached into his coat and took out the folded crayon drawing, Patricia, Mommy Ray, now laminated in thin plastic so it would never tear. He looked at it for a long time. Then he slipped it back inside the breast pocket, right over the place where his heart still beat too hard. Vincent's voice came from behind him, quiet. "They're gone, boss."
Clean.
New names, new country, new life. No trail. Raymond nodded once. He didn't turn around.
"Burn the farm," he said.
"Burn the bunker. Burn every safe house we used. I want ash." Vincent hesitated. "All of it. All of it." A pause. "And the penthouse?" Raymond finally turned. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes carried something new, something ancient and tender and unbreakable. "Leave the penthouse," he said. "Let the city keep one room where monsters were allowed to be human for a little while." Vincent understood. He always had. He walked away to make the calls. Raymond stayed on the ridge until the sun was fully up and the sky turned the color of Patricia's purple crayon oceans. Then he got back in the Escalade and drove east, into the city that had always owned him and now somehow felt smaller. The Empire was waiting. Men who had heard whispers of what happened at Blackwater Dock, of a yacht drifting empty with its owner missing, of containers full of ghosts that would never speak again, waited for orders with new respect in their eyes. The senator's seat was already cold. 3 CEOs had vanished from their boards. The trafficking ring was a memory burning in the rain. Raymond walked into his office on the 89th floor at 10:03 a.m. wearing the same blood-stiff shirt from the night before. No one commented on it. He sat behind the desk that had once belonged to men now dead and opened the top drawer. Inside lay the original $5 bill, still folded the way Patricia had given it to him. He took it out, smoothed it flat, and placed it in a small shadow box frame that had waited empty for years. Then he hung it on the wall opposite his chair, the first thing anyone would see when they entered the room. A reminder. A warning. A promise. The city kept moving below him, trains and traffic and ordinary lives that would never know how close they had come to drowning. Raymond watched it all with different eyes now. He was harder than ever, colder, sharper, more lethal. The part of him that had softened in a little girl's presence had not vanished. It had simply gone underground, deeper than any bunker, wrapped around a single crayon drawing and a silver locket somewhere over the Atlantic. Years would pass. Patricia would grow tall and fierce and kind. Maria would laugh again without looking over her shoulder. They would speak his name only in whispers, on birthdays and stormy nights, the way children speak of guardian angels who used to be devils. And somewhere in the city, whenever a white van lingered too long near a school, whenever a powerful man's hand reached for a child it had no right to touch, that hand would suddenly stop. Because a shadow would move in the corner of the room. Because a phone would ring with no voice on the other end. Because a black Escalade would appear at the curb and a tall man in a dark coat would step out, and the world would remember that some debts are paid forward forever. Raymond never saw them again. He didn't need to. He felt the locket against Patricia's heart every time she laughed. He saw the drawing every time he closed his eyes. And on the nights when the city grew too loud and the old ghosts tried to crawl back into his chest, he would touch the $5 bill behind glass and remember the exact weight of a 7-year-old girl asleep in his arms, trusting him with everything she had. Monsters still walked the world. But Patricia A. Caldwell, whoever she was called now, would never face them alone again. Raymond had made sure of that. He had paid the only way he knew how, with blood, with fire, and with the last soft piece of his soul. And if that wasn't redemption, it was close enough. The king returned to his throne harder than ever, but the throne now had a crack running straight through it, shaped like a little girl's handprint. And through that crack, light got in. The city never noticed, but the shadows did, and they protected what was his. Always.